Federalist No. 10. The same subject continued. The Union is a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. From the Daily Advertiser, Thursday, November 22nd, 1787. To the people of the State of New York. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries of liberty derive most of their specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired, but it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided, not according to the rules of justice or the rights of the minor party, but of the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. It will be found, indeed, on a candid review of our situation, that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found, at the same time, that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements, and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. By a faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion, or of interest, adverse to the rights of the other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction, the one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction, the one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy, that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. The diversity of the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to the uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the other respective proprietors, ensues a division of society into different interests and parties. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity, according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well of speculation as of practice. An attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons or other descriptions of fortunes who have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold, and those who are without property, have ever informed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow of a necessity in civilized nations, and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation, and involves the spirit of a party and a faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment, and, not improbably, corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet what are many of the most important acts of legislation, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens? And what are the different classes of legislators but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? Is a law proposed concerning private debts? Is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. Justice ought to hold balance between them, yet the parties are, and must be, themselves the judges. And the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged, and in what degree, by restrictions on foreign manufacturers, are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither with sole regard to justice and the public good. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality. Yet there is, perhaps, no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved in their own pockets. It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another, or the good of the whole. The interference to which we are brought is, that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought by means of controlling its effects. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and form of the popular government, it is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Let me add that it is the great desideratum by which this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. By what means is this object attainable? Evidently, by one or two only. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passions or interest, must be rendered, by their number and local situation, unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. They are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals, and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together, that is, in proportion to their efficacy becomes needful. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens, who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit no cure of the mischiefs of faction. A common passion of interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is such that democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security and the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians, who have patronized this species of government, have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would, at the same time, be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect, and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature and the cure, and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. Two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government, in the latter, to a small number of citizens elected by the rest; secondly, the great number of citizens, and greater sphere of country, over which the latter may be extended. The effect of the first difference is, on one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for that purpose. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers, or local prejudices, or of sinister designs may by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages, and then betray the interests of the people. The question resulting is, whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public will. And it is clearly decided in favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. In the first place, it is to be remarked that, however small that republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number, in order to guard against the cabals of a few, and that, however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number, in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. Hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents, and being proportionally greater in the small republic, it follows that, if the proportion of the fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option, and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, and the suffrages of the people being more free, will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. It must be confessed that in this, as in with most other cases, there is a mean, on both sides of which conveniences will be found to lie. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with their local circumstances and lesser interests. As by reducing it too much, you render him unduly attached to these, and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. The federal constitution forms a happy combination in this respect, the great and aggregate interests being referred to the national, the local, and particular to the state legislatures. The other point of difference is, the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of a republican than democratic government. It is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations to be less dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing of a majority, the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily they will concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend this sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of the citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be much more difficult for all who fill it to discover their own strength. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have common motive to invade the rights of the other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who fill it to discover their own strength, and to act in unison with each other. Besides the other impediments, it may be remarked that, where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the Union over the states composing it. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of a union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. Does it consider in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? In an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the union increase this security? Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority? Here again, the extent of the union gives it the most palpable advantage. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but it will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in part of the Confederacy, but a variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project, will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. In the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular country or district than an entire state. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to a Republican government. And, according to degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. Publius. Analysis and summary. Madison is arguing that factionalization, which has been the bane of most historical republics, democracies, and even kingdoms and empires, is one of the primary things that the proposed U.S. Constitution would keep in check. He notes that through history, our republics and democracies have fallen apart due to various factions arising in their ranks and souring their government and population. He notes that people considering whether to ratify the Constitution in the states were concerned about this faction problem and worried that a union of states with a federalized government overseeing it all would be susceptible to factions taking it over and corrupting it, as had happened to all previous republics and democracies. He addresses this by noting it is a problem and proposing some methods by which one deals with it. He said you can either set up the government which deals with political factions by removing the causes or controlling the effects. He doesn't think removing the causes is a good idea, because you have to remove the people's ability to be free by removing liberty to curb their natural tendency to factionalize. Liberty, which causes factions because people are free to associate with whomever they want and think whatever they want, is the primary goal of this new government, and removing it would be far worse a cure than the disease of factionalization itself. He likens removing liberty to prevent the cause of factions to removing air to prevent fire. You may stop one thing that can do damage, but at preventing the one single thing, you need to have a functioning government and populace, or life itself, to do it. Damage to something is more tolerable than that thing's complete inability to exist or do anything, period. The other thing which causes factions to arise in basically any governing system is causing or forcing the citizenry to have the same opinions, passions, and interests. He said that this is impossible because each unique individual is different. So too will be their interests and conclusions, wants and desires, so no one will ever be able to agree on wanting the same thing to begin with. They will all naturally tribalize and fall into factions based on the default behavioral trends abrogated by human nature. The founders were not retarded Marxists or Hegelian social constructionists who thought either that there is no human nature or that you can obfuscate human nature by tyrannizing the populace into obeying groupthink. They knew no matter what you did as a government, human nature would persevere and cause people to think differently and group up into factions to protect or advocate or propel their interests. The notion is as impossible to accomplish as stripping liberty from the populace would be sinful and counter to the Federalist aims and goals, of the country's aims and goals. So instead, Madison suggests controlling the effects of factionalization by adopting the proposed constitution, which has built into it mechanisms which will prevent the tyranny of the majority, or any other group, from dictating what the remainder of the population will have to endure as a result. That there is no fighting the formation of factions, because it is human nature to tribalize, but to reduce the probability that any faction will ever become powerful enough to tyrannize everyone else. He said the Constitution will accomplish this by federalizing the nation into a constitutional republic, with representative elected officials voting in the legislature to create, implement, or rescind policy and law. At the time, the U.S. was under the Articles of Confederation, which gave limited powers to a national government at the single vote behest of each individual state, by representatives of those states sent to conventions to cast said votes. So the population at large already had an idea of how representative government thing worked, but that the current model was insufficient to get anything done because the states so rarely agreed on anything unanimously. That money could not be raised to pay off national debts, ferment and run an effective military, or ensure contracts between states were enforced, thus not protect any specific property rights among individuals in the states. The proposed U.S. Constitution would make a stronger central government, but one very restricted, so the federal government could do all of those things, but be unable to suppress or oppress individuals within the nation, particularly not by factional fiat. To facilitate that, the founders organized the Constitution into 3 branches of government, as proposed by Machiavelli, and expanded upon by Locke and Montesquieu, so checks and balances could make sure no one branch overstepped their bounds. The legislature would make laws, the judiciary would make sure that they were just and in line with the Constitution itself, and the executive would enforce those laws, with methods by which each branch could check the power of the others and spread the process so no one branch could be too powerful. And through inevitable factionalization, oppress the populace. Likewise, the legislature in particular was broken into 2 houses, one elected by a popular vote among the states, one by a vote among the state legislatures, which would make it harder for any one faction to impose their will on any other. They would all be checking and balancing and feuding with each other, and would not have the ability to overstep their bounds and mess with everyone else. In Federalist No. 10, Madison explains the reasoning for this, to counter arguments anti-federalists were making at the time to either not ratify the proposed constitution, or further fragment it into individual sovereign states with no union, or a smaller union of confederacies. Madison noted that contrary to popular opinion, larger unions, especially from within the Republican form of government, made it harder for factions to gain any specific majority over any single branch or legislative body. That while smaller republics could gain a majority pretty easily, a larger one, with so many wide and varied individually elected members, would have trouble aligning all of their specific unique interests into a coalition, with which the tyranny of the majority could be exploited. A republic with 20 voting members only had to get 11 on board to become a majority, but one with 200 would have to get 101 for a majority, and that is much harder to get 101 people to agree on something than it is 11. Thereby providing a buttress against the negative effects of factionalization by making it difficult to get a majority, unless all those individual interests and passions could be quelled, and move forward because the proposed idea was good enough that it did not benefit any faction singularly, but had to benefit multiple ones that made up the legislature. Similarly, since popular government was by definition concerned with what the majority wanted to do, this proposal would make it so that whatever the majority, made up of a larger body of people, will have to come into a cohesive agreement with outside factions in order to get something done. Your legislature has to be able to conduct the business of government, but you don't want government to become a mere fiat for a majority who may be perfectly willing to strip other citizens of their rights and privileges, should the history of political or economic factionalization be repeated. To best facilitate this, Madison suggests that they continue to follow the tenets and structure of a republic, eschewing democracy outright for a tendency to factionalize and easily apply the majority over the minority, which will almost certainly lead to the loss of rights and representation amongst the minority members of the population, which has happened every time anyone has ever tried democracy in the past. Madison acknowledges that no system is perfect, and that nothing will fix all of the issues he wants to fix. But ever the legal pragmatist, he thinks following the edicts of a restrained, republican form of government, along with the structure of the Constitution which separates and balances the powers, and slyly turns each specific part of the federal government against itself so they'll be busy bickering with one another rather than suppressing the populace, will reduce the problems to the most manageable level. Tolerating that some issues will arise and nothing can ever be truly perfect, he seems to strongly imply that this system he set up and is advocating for under the pseudonym Publius, shared with Hamilton and Jay, will be the best possible remedy. It will suppress factionalization and tyranny better than anything anyone else has really tried in the past, and give the people the liberty they need to prosper and thrive. He also notes some other tenets and issues, such as the danger of too many representatives contrasted to too few, and the consequences by obsolescence, what would follow if you did not find the right number of representatives to make it function optimally. He warns of some potential sources for factionalization, warns against some specific issues, and declares being fair to all citizens is what everyone should aim for, rather than appeasing some arbitrary faction that will arise. Madison finishes the article by making another argument in favor of his system to offset and compartmentalize corruption, and finally declare that the young country ought to have zeal for republicanism and all that it implies and entails, and for federalism itself.